Hey everybody, welcome once again to Research Methods from my living room. Here I want to give you some feedback on lab assignment 9, which was the one where you created your own survey questions because one of your next assignments is to turn in your draft of survey questions for your individual survey research project. So I thought it would be a good idea to just go through and showing some tips that you might could use in conducting your survey based on some questions that you've already given me. Y'all did a great job on these and I love them and I'm just so excited to share the results with you. So let's get started. Okay, so remember that y'all created some questions about stress in college students as an example. Overall, we had a total of at least 147 questions. I think some of them were sort of repeats of similar questions. It makes sense. We're all thinking about the same concept, and so we're going to create some of the same questions. But as far as unique items, there were around 3 or 4 unique items per student. Some of y'all did way more than that. Some of you did just a few, and then a lot of y'all overlapped, like I already said. But overall, there was also a mix of closed and open-ended questions, which I thought was cool. Y'all were kind of going for the best of both worlds. Some students did most of all or most of the other, and some had a really healthy mix in there. And I'm going to go through some specific examples later. There were some very strong questions, and then there were some that were in a format I could make some adjustments to help you improve them. And I'll give some examples of those too. But as but as far as the content y'all talked about, I noticed several different themes. And Nancy, our TA, was graceful, was awesome enough to go through all of these questions and kind of compile them together and put them into groups based on what sort of topic area they were in. So y'all's questions grouped into demographics or identifiers, the causes of stress, college courses specifically, and college credits and other aspects of classes. Of course, since it's a college student survey, many of them were focused on that. Some were about triggers of stress otherwise, and also about the symptoms or the feelings in your mind and body when you experience stress. Others were more performance based, like does it keep you from doing something specifically? Others were about quality of life. Some got very specific about relationships, about exercise and spirituality, which are kind of quality of life domains, but y'all's questions kind of grouped into these more specific ones as well. So I want to start with the demographics just to give you an overview of what people included, because you may have done some of these, but you may not have done all of them. So you may get a good look at what a comprehensive list of demographics might look like for a particular population that you're wanting to sample and study. It was very common to ask about age, gender, ethnicity, what school you go to, your enrollment status, like full-time or part-time, what year you are in school, like first year, sophomore, junior, etc. Your financial aid status, I thought was interesting. There were a lot of questions about that, about your scholarship, about how you're paying for school, basically, because that could be a huge source of stress, I'm sure. Where you live, whether it's on campus or off, your major. I mean, there may be more stressful majors, and that's something that you might be interested in looking at. Work status, family commitments, like having children, caring for parents, whether you're married, your religion, any mental health diagnoses. I thought this one was especially important. People were bringing up issues like ADHD, anxiety disorders, and you would definitely want to know whether your participants have some kind of diagnosis like that if you're studying stress, because those who have disorders are probably going to experience and manage stress differently than those who don't have psychological disorders. So I thought that was a very important inclusion there. And especially that ADHD came up a lot. I think it's interesting that people normally think about that only in terms of paying attention, but many of y'all, I feel like, may have done this out of some personal experience of what it feels like to try to manage all your responsibilities with ADHD. And I think that personal experience and stuff that y'all are passionate about really came through in these survey items. And I thought that was cool. Now, I don't know anything about any individual students. This is just, I got to see the compiled results in general. And then I went through and looked at a couple, but I'm not making any guesses about anybody's mental diagnoses or anything like that specifically. Overall, in demographics, the ones that came up more often as closed questions were the ones that I think would group best as closed questions would be things like, do you live on or off campus? What year of school are you? What's your enrollment status? And maybe some about your financial aid status or how you're paying for school. The others that might work best as open items could be things like age, what institution you go to, number of classes. Financial aid status could also be asked about in this way. Major, Family commitments, you could have several different questions about that if you were interested in it. Gender is you can be more inclusive if you leave it open-ended. You can do kind of a closed version of gender, and we'll look at that later in the presentation as well. Ethnicity can be asked about very similarly. Most questions about ethnicity are not exhaustive, so that's why I like to put it in an open-ended category and ask people how they identify, because people who are South Asian, like from India or Bangladesh, or Southeast Asian, like from Malaysia, may have no idea where to put themselves on American race categories, or people from the Middle East. White people may not consider them white, but they don't necessarily fit onto any of those checkbox categories of white, Black, Asian, Pacific Islander, those types of things. So I like to leave ethnicity open-ended because American census categories are kind of exclusive. Religion is another one I would leave open because there's probably going to be a lot of things you might leave out. There's a Baha'i temple in Tyler, Texas, but if you haven't driven past it a lot or you're not familiar with that faith, that's something you might leave off of your little list for people to check off what their religion is. You might even be interested in specific religious denomination and what that has to do with how people manage stress. If that was a research question of yours, you might let people put in their own, because there's a lot of kind of non-denominational houses of worship. There's a lot of maybe denominations that you just didn't think of that might be common in this area, but if you don't have personal experience with it, your experimenter bias can kind of creep up and you might leave it out without really meaning to. I think work and work hours could be answered well in an open-ended fashion. There's ways to do it closed too, but I might ask open-ended first, at least about what kind of work do you do. And then diagnoses, I would leave open-ended as well. I might do a little bit of both. I might give some categories, but then I might leave a place for people to self-report anything that wasn't on there before. So I'm not saying these are how you have to do these types of questions. This is just how I might group them in order to avoid being exclusive. Y'all talked a lot about causes of stress in your questions too, whether you feel like your stresses are more internal or external. So in general, y'all ask questions about whether people's stress was internal or external to themselves, how they define stress, how frequently they experience it, which activities or tasks are sources of it. There were lots about the pandemic, of course, school, work, and family, test anxiety specifically. Some ask people to list their triggers, list times and locations that they feel most stressed, and then questions about sleep cropped up here a lot too. Stuff that I found kind of interesting to take away from this was I would never have thought to ask participants to define what stress means for them. I would have maybe provided ranges of different questions and asked how often do you experience X, Y, and Z, and gotten at the answers that way. But I like asking participants what it means to them to be stressed. I think that can be important. There were many open-ended items, which I think is important here because people's sources of stress could come from all over the place. So y'all asked broad things like what stresses you out the most. And then you did have questions about specific sources like schoolwork, tests. Of course, they kind of skewed academic, which makes sense. It's a survey for college students. So y'all were on target there about work and about the pandemic because of the times that we are living in now. So those were some strengths I liked about the topics y'all covered. And then when it comes to college courses and credits, y'all asked a lot of things that seem sort of predictable here for me, like course load and credit hours and which types of classes you're taking, whether you feel stressed when you're at school, how busy your schedule is, number of assignments, etc. But there were some interesting things that stood out to me that, again, I might not have thought of, but I love that these popped up. That's one reason I love these kind of crowdsourced assignments where I get to see what y'all would create. You asked whether having a busier schedule causes you more or less stress. I thought that was interesting. I would have just assumed busy people are more stressed, but then I thought about myself, and my husband always tells me, I think you need to be working. Like, you don't really know what to do if you take too long off of work. Like, if we have longer than a week break or something, I mean, I can comfortably take a week off from doing anything work related, but beyond that, I just sort of fall apart. Over the summer, I didn't teach classes, and I was just a blob on the couch for like weeks at a time. And I was unhappy, and I had like physical complaints that I feel like may have even been stress related. So I need routines and schedules, and work gives me a good way to do that. So actually, I think that there's a sweet spot for a busy schedule for me. I like to stay busy, not too busy, like busy 8 to 5 and relax afterwards, relax on the weekends. But having a completely clear schedule actually is kind of a source of stress for me. At first, I thought this question was strange. Like, of course, a busier schedule makes you more stressed. But then I reflected on that some more. So thanks for making me reflect on that, people who wrote these questions. Y'all asked, does your school have mental health aid available? That's important. I think those that receive federal funding typically do, but not all of them might. And their counseling center might be overwhelmed, and you may have months before you can get an appointment or something like that. So asking about availability of support, I think, was very important here. Something I thought was interesting too was the learning style question. Are you a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learner? Because I think what might have been behind this question was thinking about whether you are in classes that kind of work against your teaching style, your learning style, and whether that stresses you out. And another one I thought was cool was, would you take a class that was aimed at helping you manage your stress better? And I totally would. And I don't know if there's something like that available for y'all. I will look into that because that sounds really awesome, right? If you need some just credits, some electives, and there's something like that around. We don't have one in the psychology and counseling department right now currently, but I would love to teach something like that because I have some experience in meditation, and one of my research areas is mindfulness. And I research emotion regulation and how people cope with their emotions and with stress and things like that. So I might have trouble always practicing what I preach, but I think it could be a really cool opportunity. I just don't know if I'll ever quite have time for that in the next few semesters. And then y'all also talked a lot about symptoms, reactions, and kind of other stuff related to stress, like whether people have panic attacks. That's an important one to ask. How often they feel on edge, whether they have headaches. I thought the physical complaint questions were interesting, and I actually think I might want to see more of those because stress does manifest in the body quite a lot for many of us. Racing thoughts, also asking about how often you seek help, how often do a certain, how often you have certain kind of reactive behaviors like crying or cleaning or binge eating. Or another interesting like concept that cropped up in this category to me was, how much of a sense of control do you have? Do you get really frustrated about things that are outside of your control? How in control of your life in general do you feel? And y'all had some cool, like a list of symptoms that I think would make a cool little like checklist where you could just check all that apply of what you experience when you're stressed, like senses of. Now, I don't think a single person did all of these, but it was just a few people's stuff kind of smushed together. But it would make one great big old long checklist question, in my opinion. Like whether you experience fear, helplessness, horror, confusion, numbness, out of body experience. I never would have thought of that one, but dissociation is common for people who have trauma, especially. So we might want to make a distinction about whether we are interested in studying people who have stress as a result of trauma, where they might have these very severe reactions, versus people who have response to everyday stress. But that numbness and out of body experience and confusion, like those are very like PTSD like, in my opinion. Irritability, worrying about the future, sluggishness. I thought that one was interesting too. And I've got some theory to explain why you might see some of these symptoms where you're sort of shutting down, and some of them where you're too activated, like having the racing thoughts and cleaning your house and binge eating and doing something a little more active. So I think that we talk about this in my physiological psychology course. We have a chapter all about emotions and stress, chapter 11. And you have a communication system in your body between the hypothalamus in the middle of your brain, the pituitary gland, also very close to the hypothalamus, and your adrenal glands, which sit right on top of your kidneys. So there's this communication system of basically stress hormones, and they help you to have energy in a quick fight or flight situation. Stress is our body's response to stress. When we feel stressed out, it's there for a good reason. It's there to help us get away or defend ourselves or defend people we love or whatever in kind of an emergency situation, that adrenaline rush, right? But for many of us, we might be experiencing chronic stress. Okay, so your body is doing that fight or flight response with that relationship between the brain and the kidneys and your stress hormone cortisol kind of flooding through your body. And what this does over time, it keeps you in this activated fight or flight state too much of the time. And so you might feel fear, helplessness, horror, irritability, worrying, racing thoughts. You might do a lot of physical actions to cope with that when you're very, very activated. But you can actually have what looks like the opposite reaction on the outside, especially in response to complex trauma, meaning you have had repeated traumatic events, or you just have chronic stress, like we see in marginalized people. So ethnic minorities, LGBTQ folks, are often under chronic stress because of discrimination and instability in their home lives and things like that. So this chronic stress over time can actually make you look more depressed. It can cause depression instead because that HPA axis of hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal glands gets just worn out. It just cannot keep producing that amount of high stress hormones all the time. And your body shuts down the stress response to protect you so that you kind of stop feeling things. And that's where you can get those dissociation, the out of body experience, the sluggishness, the stuff that y'all are writing about here. And so I got a sense from looking at all these symptoms y'all put in here that some of us who wrote these items are very well versed in stress, even if we're not research experts in it yet. It looks like we've been experiencing a lot of stress. And I think that's not particularly surprising with all the types of hurdles that college students face. So I feel like I'm learning a lot from y'all that maybe many of y'all are in this chronic shutdown state. And that can sometimes make you look lazy from the outside, but you just don't have the energy to do anything. Your body is trying to help you recover from being so activated all the time that it just kind of shuts you down where you can't do anything. And sometimes when you're in this state, you might need some like chemical or medical help to get up to the point where therapy can even help you. So if any of these things describe you that seem pretty extreme, please seek professional help that is available on campus, and they can also refer you to other people who can help you, or let me know if you don't know where to go, and I'll see what I can do to connect you to resources. So this just made me kind of hurt for some of y'all who might be experiencing some of these things. Other questions I thought were interesting was about how do you know when you're stressed? Some of us might just automatically start taking it out on the people around us with our irritability and not even notice it. But I would not have thought to put these questions about awareness in there. You might just kind of think that it's your partner's fault and they're doing things to make you mad, but you could actually just be highly stressed and not acknowledging it. So asking people, how do they know that they're stressed? What does it feel like in your body? What signals are you looking for to realize, I'm stressed out. I should probably take some time for myself. And then related to that, y'all asked a lot of questions about how do you relieve stress? And I'll get into some more examples of that later, of kind of the responses that y'all put and some ways that I might reword it. Y'all also recognize that stress can impact your performance. We know this. You could have trouble concentrating. It could inhibit your performance in general in any of your domains. You may not feel you have enough time to perform at all of the responsibilities that are being asked of you right now. One interesting thing y'all asked that I thought was cool was, what do you think what grade do you need to get to consider yourself successful? So something that may be a source of stress is your own standards or your own perfectionism. If there's healthy and unhealthy perfectionism. So if you have perfectionism about grades because you need a 4.0 to get into medical school or whatever, that makes sense. And that's something you need to prioritize. If you only need a 3.0 to get into a counseling master's program and you need to prioritize research and extracurriculars and stuff like that, maybe you need to let go of the perfectionism of the 4.0 so that you have enough energy to work on other things. So sometimes our stress can be internal because we have certain expectations that we are trying to meet that nobody else is making us do. And I'm a big offender of this one. So I thought that was really interesting that y'all brought that up. Procrastination came up a lot too, which can be both kind of like a source and a cause of stress. You might chronically procrastinate because you want to avoid things that are stressing you out. So you may be a procrastinator because you're stressed, but you could procrastinate for other reasons, and then that stresses you out. Something that I didn't see come up here is that stress can be a good thing. I don't know if I really saw that in y'all's responses. There are two basic different like cognitive ways we can think about stress when we feel it, when our body does that stress response with our adrenal glands and our pituitary gland and our hypothalamus. We can think about that in two different ways, and it impacts our health and our performance. We can think about stress in terms of a barrier, which is what all of y'all's questions were really aiming at. Like it's a problem, right? It feels terrible. But stress can also be thought of like a challenge. If you feel that adrenaline rush, you could think about it in the same way you would feel it in a sport context. Like it just gives you a competitive edge. Okay. So that is why some people probably thrive with a busy schedule, like that question from earlier, because they are viewing that stress as a challenge, as just enough motivation to keep them going. And that may be why some of y'all procrastinate too. You may just like need that fire lit under your butt to actually get the assignment done. Whereas when there's not a creeping deadline, you just can't really summon enough motivation to rise to the challenge and get it done. You don't feel challenged enough yet to have the motivation. So I might, if I were interested in stress, I might include more balanced questions that would let people tell me if they view stress as a good thing, or if they approach it in that challenge versus threat kind of way. But basically, y'all were getting at, is stress a significant barrier for you? Is it preventing you from doing the things you need and want to do? And I saw this break down into many of the major quality of life domains that researchers kind of have divided life up into, which can be physical, psychological, social, family, and environmental. And many of y'all's questions aimed at these. And the quality of life questions did as well, but I might want to see more of a balance between the domains. So overall, I saw a lot of questions about substance abuse, sleep, social life, motivation, how people cope with change, whether they have pets. That might fall sort of under family or maybe kind of environmental. I'm not sure where to put that. And then whether you were seeking professional treatment. But I might have asked a few more questions about environmental, like what kind of conditions do you live in? Not just who else you live with, but like, do you have to live in an unsafe neighborhood, or do you live in a very noisy area next to a highway, or do you live in a place that is so rural it's hard to get to any of the things you need to do to meet your needs? Those could be sources of stress as well. Or do you just live in a crappy apartment where you can hear everything through the walls, and your landlord is kind of always on your back or whatever? So I might have added in a few more environmental ones about how much time people get to spend in nature, and what their living conditions are like, whether they have to live with people who are really dirty. That can be a huge source of stress. I grew up in a disgusting home, and it was a constant source of stress. So those are just a few more things I might have personally added in, but I always just feel like I learned something when I see what y'all put. Y'all asked so many questions about relationships as well, that was kind of its own category. I found it really interesting that somebody asked, are you envious of others? Maybe that can be a source of stress. That's another one where your expectations may be your source of stress, not really the other people so much. It's more of your framing, and that's another internal source one. So I was thinking mostly of external stressors, but I love these internal ones that y'all had creeping in here. The major conclusions that I took away from this section were the empath questions. And I wonder if Chloe did these. I would have to go back and look. I know Chloe's super into this empath stuff. I don't know about the rest of y'all. But some of these questions grouped into kind of, are you picking up stress from other people? Do you feel really upset when other people experience trauma around you? Like, do you kind of get traumatized from their trauma? Can you tell when somebody else is stressed, even if they're not telling you? Do the major people in your life kind of have an effect on your stress level based on their mental status? But then y'all also asked a lot of questions about support, which I think was very important. Do you have people you can depend on when you're stressed out? Are you happy with your marital status? So even if you're single, are you like stressed out because you can't find a partner? If you're married, are you happy with that marriage? Um, do you have anybody to talk to when you feel stressed? And does that help you when you do? That came up a lot too. Some people sharing may not make them feel better necessarily, especially because of the responses of the people you share with. Or maybe you haven't been socialized to share your stress much with other people. And then y'all asked also, does your stress, not only does your social life impact your stress, but does your stress impact your social life? So this is where the envy question came in. I think that's one that could really affect your ability to make friends, as if you're envious of them. And then somebody just asked point blank, does stress ruin your social life? Um, which I feel like might be a little bit of a leading question, but I do like where that is going. And I have some alternative ways of wording some similar questions that we'll look at here soon. And one of the last domains y'all brought up was exercise. I was surprised that this was kind of a short one and that there weren't more questions about it. So here are the questions that y'all asked. Is exercise important to you? What kinds of exercises do you do to relieve stress? How much activity do you get? And then y'all asked about how your physical health has been. Has it improved or gotten worse? Has it changed at all recently? There's so much research supporting the benefits of exercise for mental health and for managing stress that personally I would have put more questions in here about that, because I might be curious about whether they're doing the types of workouts that can really help them the best, whether they're working out enough and things like that. But maybe that concept doesn't need a lot of questions to capture. Maybe that's why we only have a few here, but y'all still realize the importance of your physical health and your fitness on your stress levels. And something that I didn't quite think of until I saw y'all's questions was that spirituality came up as well. There were some vague ones like, how is your spiritual life? And then there were some more specific ones like, do you believe in God? And how would you describe your relationship with God? Do you find yourself feeling bitter at God? I would caution you here to try to make sure that to try to be aware of your own experiments or biases that might be creeping in when you write questions like this. So if I were to see this list of questions, I think it's good that you started with, do you even believe in God? Because they could just put no, and then it's kind of NA for the rest of the questions, right? But then they really don't have a way to describe their spiritual life if they don't have a religion with one big guy called God that they talk to and have a relationship with, right? So that's unique only to some religious traditions, and there are many others that don't really have that framework. So you might ask yourself, are my questions general enough that a Buddhist could answer them? And would it include their spiritual practices? Would it include hippie spiritual people who are really into crystals and stuff, just kind of spiritual, not religious? Would it apply to Wiccans or pagans? Would it apply to Muslims? Would it apply to Jewish people? So just try and make your questions a little more inclusive. And one way we can do that is to evaluate participants' relationship with whichever spirituality they have, instead of looking at specific questions of like the content of their spirituality. And ways you could do this is you could ask, how does your spirituality help you cope with stress? Do you do contemplative practices like prayer or meditation? Do you have social support from your spirituality? So do you have like a faith community that helps you relieve stress? And that could work for just about anybody, right? So Satanist, Wiccan, Buddhist, whatever, Southern Baptist, any of those might have a community of people that helps them relieve their stress. And then there's often, but not always, in many religions, religious texts and teachings that can help relieve them of their stress. That's one of the main draws to religions when people join them, is not only do you get the social support, the contemplative practice, that quiet time with your spirituality, like a prayer or a meditation practice, but there's also teachings that can give you comfort, kind of words of wisdom or words of comfort. And so regardless of somebody's spirituality, you could ask kind of these same things you're interested in, just in a slightly different way that would include basically everybody. Now, I understand that some of y'all might have been wording these questions because you might have been thinking, this is a survey I might give people who are in my own faith community. Like, what if this was a survey I wanted to give at my church in the college youth group or something like that. And so that would make sense if your questions are going to be very much based in and kind of framed around one faith system. But if we're just thinking about college students in general, we want to open it up so that we're being more inclusive. Y'all could also think about a relationship with spirituality and whether that could also be a source of stress. So if a person lives with people who are kind of forcing a particular spiritual practice or community attendance or something on them that they don't choose for themselves, that could be a source of stress where kind of family spirituality is stressing them out. Maybe even with their own spirituality. And this is a good general way of asking the "Are you bitter at God?" question that y'all have here. You could put something about, do you have any inner conflict between the way you live your life and the teachings of your religion or of your spiritual tradition? You could ask questions like, are you experiencing doubt about your spirituality and religious teachings? And is that a source of stress for you? Um, People also could have an unsupported religious community. So they could have teachings and contemplative practice that comfort them, but let's think maybe about LGBTQ folks who might feel excluded from many church communities or something like that. So they may have that may be a source of stress for them, is that they have a relationship with their spirituality that they want, but they may not be able to find the community that they want to support that. So there's a lot of ways where spirituality and stress can be wrapped up together, and we can just ask those questions in a broader way. I like where y'all were going with this because I do think spiritual life, it's one of those major 6 quality of life domains that researchers look at. I think it is an important variable to look at, how it's associated with stress. And here's just a couple of little adjustments you could make to do that to include everybody. And speaking of adjustments, I saw some good questions that I would just make some little changes in the answer choices or how you ask them that could really strengthen your survey designs. Some of these were things like, do you find yourself dwelling on the past? Do you take time out for yourself? So these could be frequency questions, like how often do you do these things? Keep in mind that if a higher score you have if like a higher number means higher stress, you might want to reverse code one of these, where do you take time out for yourself would be reverse coded, because a lower score on this, I never take time for myself, would mean more stressful. So these are kind of coded reversely from each other, but either way, the answer choices that were given were on this 1 to 6 scale of always, very frequently, occasionally, rarely, very rarely, and never. A couple of things I noticed about this is that to me, it feels a little backwards from most surveys that I see. So in most surveys, I think many of your participants are going to translate higher number equals more of the thing you're asking. And so if you put frequency where 1 is always, they may not be reading those carefully and they may do the opposite of what you actually expected them to do and what they actually mean. So I would flip those around and I would probably reduce these. I did a typo on this. It should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I took out column 5 and just didn't rename the 6 there. Sorry about that. But I would just put 5 answer choices so that sometimes could be in the middle. And that was mostly because I had a hard time figuring out if rarely and very rarely had enough of a difference between them. And if I was taking these questions on a survey, I would struggle with what to put there. So I just broke it down into a few. I just took that one out and then flipped the scale around. And now we have a new 1 to 5 scale instead of 1 to 6, where I forgot to fix my slide there. There were some that had a cool format. I like that some of y'all already put yours into like a table where you had the strongly disagree, all the options at the top, and you wouldn't have to repeat the options like every time you wrote a question, right? I really like that. And participants like them too if you don't put too many, more than like 10 in a table, and then they have to go flip up to the top of the survey or scroll back up, and it's kind of difficult to do. So the questions this person asked, I reworded them slightly because there were a few typos, but there was stuff like, does college make you stress? Does stress stop you from performing well? Do you feel stress at least once a week due to college? Does stress ruin your social life? I liked these questions, but especially the format. So I've got some suggestions of how you could reword those. If you're making it your answer choices be agree and disagree stuff, you might want to make your items statements instead of questions, because then they could just say, I agree with this statement, like this statement describes me. So I reworded them into school stresses me out, stress keeps me from doing my best. That's how I reworded the performance one a little bit. And then the social life one, does it ruin your social life? I felt that one was slightly leading. So I walked back the language to make it slightly less extreme and said, stress keeps me from enjoying time with my friends. And then there was another one thrown in there of, do you stress at least once a week due to college? And that seems like the answer choices shouldn't be those agree to disagree ones. To me, that feels more like a frequency one, like the one we looked at earlier. So I would bring that one outside of this matrix or table and ask, how often do you feel stressed? And then give them the frequency options. So your questions might group into a few different like response options like that. Just kind of put the ones that should be agree to disagree together and put the frequency ones together, because if you kind of alternate, your participants might get confused easily. But overall, I still thought these were good questions to ask. And then another neat format I saw was a checklist. This person said, what would you say stresses you out the most in college? And they had the options: friends, schoolwork, classes, not enough time to do stuff, professors. There's a few different ways I might tweak this one. And I have several different choices here for you, because there's not necessarily one right way to do survey questions. There are many different options depending on what you are studying. So I changed it into a check all that apply, because it may be hard to pick just the one. What's the one most? Um, and even in this case, it may be that the one that's my number one may not even be on here. So I included the other option so they could always put something that's not listed, because our survey answers need to be exhaustive and inclusive. People need to be able to answer it, and they need to be included in it, or else they're just going to skip it and we don't get any data, and then our participants kind of feel left out. So I actually added family and housework. I put school, class, and professors kind of all together, but depending on what you're studying, you might want to separate some of these. I put work in another category too that I didn't see on there. And then money was one I saw some students bring up that was very important. So I wanted to put that one in there too. But participants might come up with things I didn't think of. Y'all did that all the time when I was reading these survey questions. So we always want an other there if we can, unless it's like time intervals where we have all of them covered or something like that, or a year in school or something like that where we got all our bases covered. We want an other. And then if I wanted to ask them to pick just one, I could do that. I just split them up and added a few more, like I already talked about. But depending on how you are conceptualizing stress, what your hypotheses are, you might want to have different options here. Like I said, there's no one right way. So another thing you might want to think about is if maybe your hypotheses focus on college students' family situations and that being a source or maybe relief from stress. So you might want to break down that family category even more. You might have a question just about family sources of stress by itself, and you might have options like, about how many people live in your household, which family members live in your household, and then ask more about which family members are your main sources of stress, like your parents, your grandparents. Do you live with an in-law or something like that, with children? So there's a variety of different living situations that might be causes of stress for people, and you could try and capture which ones are important to your participants. You might want to focus more on the money question. You could ask just a question about money sources of stress, like net income, sources of income. Ask about what's their greatest expenditures in their budget, like rent or gas or tuition or groceries. You could ask questions about whether students have used free services on campus, like the food bank and stuff like that. Your theory or hypotheses might focus more on students' work status. So ask more questions and different questions about hours, type of work, whether their job has proper protections from COVID, which I feel like is a huge source of stress right now for many people. And then your theories and hypotheses, like for many of y'all about college students, might focus more on the college itself, of course. So you could ask more and more detailed questions about their schedule, their courses, the format of their courses, different behaviors that instructors do, type and number of assignments, extracurricular involvement, their major, availability of campus resources, how often they seek those out, tutoring and those types of things, mentor center, etc. Another different way you could ask this question is ask them to rank. So you might just say, like, put a 1 for your top most greatest source of stress and put a 7 for your least, and kind of rank all these in between. You might just ask them to rank their top 3. So just think about the fact that there are many different ways you can do this. And then I found a few unusual answer choices too. Like, someone asked about age, and they put them into categories that I don't know, the cutoff numbers were a little unusual to me. I don't see these often. And I don't know if they were very kind of logical cutoff values of 26 to 33, 34 to 41, 42 or older. Now I kind of see the trend of all of these being very young. And that's partially because you're asking about college students. The huge majority of them are pretty young, right? There's a lot of non-traditional students over age 22-ish or whatever, but or over age 24. But you could have people at any age. I mean, in one of my first classes I taught at UT Tyler, I had a student who turned 61 while they were in my class, and ran a triathlon and competed in a triathlon that weekend of their birthday, by the way, which was very inspiring. Also, kind of made me think, wow, I'm almost 30 and I can't do that. Is it too late for me to start? um, so you could ask about age differently, that ask people to report their age in years. You could, if you wanted to make it a closed question and you wanted to group it, you might ask it in terms of who's considered an early scholar, so 17 or younger. Traditional college student age is considered 18 to 24. That could be another choice. And then you could say 25 plus is non-traditional. If that's all you were interested in, you could do that too. You could break people up into generations, because that's kind of an important way we categorize age oftentimes. So I put the cutoff years for Generation Z, Millennials, Generation X, Baby Boomers. You're not as likely to have many of those, but I have taught Baby Boomers as my younger millennial self. And I mean, you see these news stories every now and then of like a 91-year-old finally graduating or taking some classes in something they've always been interested in. So include the silent generation and the greatest generation too. Who knows? But the way to be most inclusive is just to ask open-ended. But it all depends on your research question. If you had some theory about why 26 to 33-year-olds might be different from 34 to 41, then it would make sense to ask your question in this way. But without some kind of theory and previous research that group people into those categories, it may not make a lot of sense. A good inclusive list of answer choices that I saw for gender was male, female, non-binary, not sure. I might reword that as questioning, but there's not really anything wrong with not sure. I think that's just the language people often use in the LGBTQ community. Rather not say. Some people would say, I don't want you to research gender differences about me, or it's none of your business. That's a good option to give people. And then other or describe, because they may put something that we didn't think about. Gender labels can be very specific sometimes. So they could be like non-binary femme or non-binary male presenting, or they may put a variety of different things there. And so we want them to be able to represent themselves. One interesting little piece of potential experimenter bias here, though, that I try to be aware of when I ask about gender is, why does male always come first? And it almost always does when y'all make these lists. And for most of us, it's just kind of the default. It feels like it's the shorter word. Female is just like a different version of the same word. And I might ask you to question if there's a reasoning behind the order here. So if there's something that may introduce some kind of bias on my part of me thinking about male kind of being default and female and everything else as kind of other and not normal or whatever, that's kind of a common bias in the history of research, by the way. And I know that sounds silly. It is just such a tiny detail of the wording of questions, but up until like the 1990s, for example, women died at far greater rates in car accidents, with kind of this, even in the same types of sort of crashes and like impact to the vehicles and stuff like that, compared to men who survived, because crash test dummies were kind of modeled after typical male bodies, and none of them were made smaller or more feminine in shape. Up until the 1990s, cars had been around for many, many decades by that point. I don't know quite how long crash test dummies had been used, probably since like the 60s or 70s. So it took people a long time to even go, huh, why don't we think about making these cars safe for women too? Because we just kind of think of male as like default or intersex. If you get a unisex t-shirt, it's kind of made for like a squarish male-ish body, right? It's not really designed around a female body. The text is going to read differently on somebody with breasts versus somebody who doesn't have them, or um, something like that. So just maybe think about, could I put these in a way that looks non-biased? And the way I typically do that is just alphabetical order, because that way, if anybody were to ever ask me about the order, I can say there's some kind of system behind it. It's just alphabetical. And here, we could easily do that by just sticking female first and then rather not say at the bottom. But this one's pretty close to being how I would put it in a less biased way. Now, I've got my own experimenter biases for sure, but when I first started researching, like in my own research methods class, I needed my eyes open to a few more of these. And I feel like some of y'all are still at that stage with a few different biases. And in your race breakdown, I always like to put ethnic response options in alphabetical order as well, because that's another place where you might put white, black, Asian, just like in the order that you think of them, and that could look biased. I also found some interesting questions y'all used. So here on the top right, do you have any healthy or unhealthy coping mechanisms to handle stress? Or some of y'all asked, do y'all have natural mechanisms to handle stress? There was a few different questions that asked almost the same thing here, so I kind of grouped them together. I would say with this one, I like this question, and this is an interesting research question, right? But what I might change about it is make it less open to interpretation, because our participants may not be very educated about what's a healthy coping mechanism. That's something that if we don't learn it from our parents and we don't go to therapy about it, we might just not know. If we don't take a class about stress management or something like that. So we may think that it is healthy to have a drink every time you get stressed out. Boy, I've just had a long day and I always need a beer after work. Um, if you can't manage without it, that may not be healthy, right? And if it impacts your sleep, that may not be healthy. Some people might always kind of avoid or distract themselves from stress, and that over time can be unhealthy as well. But without education on that, people may not know for sure. So, and also, do you have any natural ways of handling stress? I, as a participant, can interpret the word natural many different ways, and I may not know what an experimenter means there. So I found some ways that I might ask about stress. I just kind of drafted up a quick check. It could be a checklist type thing, or it could be rank your top three if you're interested in which ones people use. So based on the research that I have read and done in stress and emotion regulation, I grouped these into a few different types that I thought participants might understand a little bit better, but there might be different ways of doing this. So I put it into categories like avoidance and procrastination, distraction, reframing mentally, kind of like I talked about earlier with the challenge versus threat thing, problem, problem solving, verbal. I'm not as confident about this category. I just kind of threw this one together, but like journaling and talking about it with a counselor and stuff, I think kind of go together in a way. Do you cope with it artistically? Maybe you express yourself through music or visual arts or drama. I sing a lot when I'm stressed. I especially love having that time to myself to just sing loudly where nobody could hear me, like out at my parents' house in the middle of nowhere. They leave and go shopping, and I'll just sing my heart out, right? Or if I'm in my car and I don't care who hears me at the stoplight or whatever, that's a way I might cope with it. Social is a big one that came up with y'all a lot. Spiritual, y'all also brought that up. Physical behaviors, non-suicidal self-harm. I don't think I actually saw that come up in y'all's questions, but that's one that I would be interested in. Like, do you bite your nails more? Do you like pick stuff? Do you like pull out your hair? Those are actually pretty common things that people struggle with as behaviors that they do when they're stressed, or even, people cut and may do other forms of self-harm that they hide from people. And then substance abuse, y'all did come up with, but I might put stress coping strategies into these types of categories. And there's probably others I didn't think of here, or slightly different ways you group these. Other researchers have already made many different like coping strategy questionnaires before, but if I had to make one from scratch real quick, this is how I might do that. And then I, as the researcher, could categorize these as healthy and unhealthy. Like if they put substance abuse as one of their top three, that's probably unhealthy, right? Or if they put the self-harm stuff, or if they put, um, let's see, if they put avoiding as one of their top three, they may not know that that's unhealthy. Or the distracting one is not always healthy either. It depends on the context. Problem solving is not always a healthy one either, because you can keep ruminating on it and trying to think, and just like you can't get your mind off of it, even if it's a problem you can't solve right now, might keep you from sleeping. So depending on the context of other questions around this question, I, as the researcher, can categorize their coping skills as healthy or unhealthy. I may not want to ask them to do that because participants may not be quite as educated about how to do that. And we're not always the best reporters about the reasons for our own behaviors and stuff like that. So I like to sneakily ask a little more from the participants, and then I make more of those conclusions about how to judge their behaviors as healthy or unhealthy or whatever. But I have some final thoughts that I want to quote from a student that I think were very important here, that I sort of could have easily lost sight of after compiling these 150-ish unique questions that y'all created. This student wrote on at the end of their survey, I question whether it's a good idea to ask a great number of questions regarding someone's stress level. It may not be a good idea to ask more than just a few questions of someone who seems very stressed. Personally, the more someone questions me, the more stress it puts on me to answer in a way that gives just enough of an answer, but not a full account of what I may be processing at the time. Unless, of course, I've chosen to reach out to someone and dump all of my emotions about what is happening and how I've been reacting to it, sleeping more or less, crying, anger, or just muddling through until the stressor has either gone away or reduced to a manageable level. End quote. What I really appreciate about this quote is that the student said, keep it short. You can be adding to their stress. And when I'm stressed, I'm going to kind of clam up and maybe not give you very good answers about it. I thought that was a great insight here that you might want to think about in creating your surveys. You don't want to make kind of cognitive or emotional barriers for your participants. And also think about the limitations of self-report. So this person talked about how I may not be able to even give you good answers if I'm already stressed, and you're kind of adding to that. So keep it clever and creative, but short. And I think those are great words to live by when it comes to creating your survey questions. Now, you want to create more items than you actually need, and I will tell you some to get rid of. So for your survey drafts, you may want to write several different versions of the same question, kind of like the ones I did as examples for you, and then I can help you decide which ones to keep. You don't have to do it that way, but I do want you to make more questions than you would actually give your participants. But keep in mind, we do want to boil it down short for your participants. Even if you're not studying stress, your participants probably are stressed in some way or other. And that's all I have for y'all on this feedback. And I hope you have a good week. And please let me know if you have any questions about your surveys. See ya.